On behalf of the United States, as the Philippines co-chair of the MICIC Initiatives Working Group, thank you for your active participation in today's webinar. You are a vital partner seeking to ensure respect for migrants' human rights, a responsibility that we must maintain no matter what challenges a crisis presents. Often when we talk about a crisis, we focus on vulnerability and how it is heightened in emergencies. But migrants are resilient and resourceful. These are strengths to build upon and support in our everyday lives, and even more so in a time of crisis, including when migrants are caught up in a country dealing with the effects of a natural disaster or an outbreak of violent conflict. The Migrants and Countries in Crisis Initiative, which we call MICIC, seeks to develop and share non-binding guidelines and effective practices to help us better assist and protect migrants when they are among the impacted population in countries experiencing these upheavals. We welcome your input and expertise towards this goal. Today's webinar will focus on the role civil society plays in these scenarios of migrants caught in conflict or natural disaster. We are striving for greater collaboration between governments, businesses, and other stakeholders to better support civil society's efforts and our own efforts in collective planning and response. We welcome your continued recommendations and inputs. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. First, we'll hear from Ms. Kate O'Malley, Australian Minister Counselor for Immigration, who will share more about this government-led initiative. Next, we'll hear from Ms. Michelle Klein-Solomon, Director of the MICIC Secretariat at the International Organization for Migration, who will give some more background, including on the scope and process of the initiative, and share some of the initial findings to date. We're pleased to hear next from Mr. John Bingham of ICMC on the vital role civil society plays in supporting migrants as they seek to mitigate the impact a crisis can have on their lives. Following John, we hear from Mr. Colin Raja of the Global Coalition on Migration, who's joining us from San Francisco. And we'll hear from him on how civil society organizations are connecting to the MICIC initiative. Following Colin, we'll hear from Mr. Bruno Atte, Director of Caritas Lebanon Migrant Center, who will share their perspective from the field. And Bruno is joining us from Lebanon today. Thank you very much. Finally, after we've heard from our panelists, we will open the floor for questions from participants, and we look forward to active participation. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Ms. Kate O'Malley from Australia, who will discuss more about the background of this government-led initiative. Kate?
Thanks very much, Michelle. And thanks very much for the opportunity to join the discussions this morning. I'm speaking, I guess, as a member of the working group of MICIC, one of the states that is involved in the process. And it's very much a collaborative exercise and has been from the beginning. And I think that's obviously very critical to the direction that we're heading. But also, it's also been a reflection of where the ideas have come from in the first place. And I think for many of us involved in UN high-level dialogue on migration and development in 2013, where the conversation and the awareness of these issues is really evolving. And that was both from the state's perspective and definitely driven by civil society as well. And I think that's, it's good, therefore, to be all together here today. As Michelle's mentioned, it's a state-led initiative. That means we're putting our energies behind thinking about how we can best address these concerns from a very practical point of view, and how we really can share as states and as stakeholders to the issue some of the experiences that we've had in these areas, but also some good practice that we're getting from the field. Why have we got this initiative running? I think, the bottom line is the displacement that we're seeing now is a really unfortunate reality of our times, with the kind of level of global mobility that we have combined with a multiple simultaneous crisis that we're seeing. That it's quite inevitable that really we see migrants caught in crisis situations. And in terms of addressing the migrants who are caught up in that, we really do have a gap there in terms of whether or not they're not addressed in sort of domestic arrangements, and they're equally often left out in terms of broader protections that are available to others. So we see that there are a number of barriers, and we've talked a lot about those in our work together to date, and those barriers are both legal but there are also practical ones, and some of those that we've mentioned and talked about in our regional consultations to date have included things like language, identity and documentation, access to proper consular services, which is obviously a key concern and a focus for governments, but also exacerbated by scenarios such as restriction on mobility. When we have sort of evolved the thinking around MICIC, it's sort of the example that everyone turns to in terms of how we responded was Libya, where we had a situation of 790,000 migrant workers needing to get out of the country, 318,000 needing real assistance for evacuation. But also, we've seen challenges for migrants in the context of other disasters, natural disasters such as the tsunami in Japan, the Hurricane Katrina in the US. So this is a global issue, and it's an issue and concern for all governments and for our stakeholders in this process. As Michelle mentioned, what we're looking for in terms of output from this process will be something non-binding, but something deeply practical. The ability for us to support each other as stakeholders to the issue, to look at issues around capacity building, what is that we need to do, and how can we harness innovation and technology perhaps as ways for approaching this more effectively. And key obviously to that in terms of us knowing and understanding the issues and going forward in terms of addressing the issues, civil society are just a key partner for us in that. So we're really pleased to be able to be a part of this discussion, but also to support the upcoming civil society dialogue.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for outlining some of the background of the initiative and highlighting that this is a global concern and an important gap to address. Next, I'd like to turn over to Ms. Michelle Klein-Solomon, the Director of the MICIC Secretariat at IOM, and she's going to further outline some of the specifics of the initiative and some of the activities to date. So, Michelle, please.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks, Kate, for that great introduction. I'm going to give a very brief presentation, one that I use in each of the regional consultations for the MICIC initiative. And as Kate said, the genesis in many ways was the Libya crisis thanks very much. The Libya crisis in 2011, which really brought to the fore the vulnerabilities of migrants. It's not that migrants have not been vulnerable before. Libya certainly was not the first example, but it was a very stark one that raised the awareness of the international community. The reason the initiative is focusing on migrants is because they present specific vulnerabilities that are different from the vulnerabilities that citizens will face when there is a crisis. And that has to do with their status as non-citizens as well as the particular circumstances. And let me just call attention to a few. For example, if migrants may have pre-existing vulnerabilities, if there's a lack of respect for migrants' human or labor rights prior to a crisis, those vulnerabilities are likely to be exacerbated during a crisis. Are we on? Yeah. Migrants' working conditions can result in additional vulnerabilities. For example, if a migrant is subject to bonded labor, or if they've been exploited in the recruitment in the process, or they've been victims of smuggling or trafficking, or have their documents confiscated by their employers, or are working in isolated circumstances, for example, domestic workers or in remote areas, that will lead to additional vulnerabilities. Personal situations of migrants can also lead to vulnerabilities. For example, the language barriers or lack of social networks to be able to be aware of mechanisms for support. Irregular status or precarious regular status could exacerbate those vulnerabilities. And certainly, stateless persons, refugees, and asylum seekers are also going to be particularly vulnerable. Finally, a climate of discrimination or xenophobia in a country will obviously affect the degree of which a migrant feels secure prior to a crisis and the experience during that. I won't go into more detail about the existing vulnerabilities, but just say that migrants may be unable to leave a country because they may lack the crisis zone, they may lack the means. If their wages have been withheld or they lack financial means to leave, they may be hindered. They may be unwilling to leave a country because, for example, their ability to stay there is dependent on a working contract, and they fear that if they leave the country, they will lose their job and the means of support for their families. Perhaps their wages have been withheld, and going home would mean that they would lose their accumulated wages. They may be unable to access humanitarian assistance because of practical or legal barriers, as Kate mentioned already. They may be unwilling or unable to return to their country of origin because they may lack the personal means to do so, or in the case, for example, of refugees and asylum seekers, it would not be safe for them to do so. These are all specific kinds of vulnerabilities that migrants or non-citizens will face that are different than citizens that need to be taken into account. And an individual migrant may find him or herself in several of those situations. So let me move quickly to the objectives of the initiative, and it's really straightforward. The key is to save lives, protect the rights and dignity of migrants, and to address the longer-term impacts for migrants and their families, as well as for their host and home communities. And the governments that are leading this initiative have made clear that they believe that better preparation will lead to more effective responses and better recovery, and that we can do better in all three of these areas. And the aim, as Kate said, is to produce non-binding principles, guidelines, and effective practices that look very concretely at those. Let me speak a moment now about the process. This is a government-led initiative. It is designed to look at the roles and the responsibilities of a range of actors, countries of origin, transit, and destination, international organizations, IOM, UNHCR, several others, civil society, migrants themselves, and diaspora associations, recruiters and employers, as well as regional actors. And we're going to, because each have something that they can do to contribute to better protect and assist migrants. And we want to tease that out and pull that together. It's also clear that there are interesting practices from around the world and ad hoc examples that would need to be pulled together and shared more broadly so we can have a process of mutual learning. Next, please. Let me speak a moment about the scope. We're looking at migrants who are caught in countries of crisis. Well, what crisis? We're talking about when a country experiences a conflict or a natural disaster. Those may affect the whole country or just a part of a country. The crisis is one that is of significant concern, that it raises the interest and the concern of the international community. It's of a sufficient level of acuteness that that's the case. Well, which migrants? Who are we talking about? And it's very clear, and I want to stress that people who are already in a country when the crisis hits, regardless of the migratory status. They can be in the country temporarily or permanently with regular or irregular status. All migrants, all non-nationals, and here, while migrant workers and their families are of particular concern, we don't want to exclude refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons who might be in a country that experiences a crisis. Obviously, there's a special protection regime for them, but there might be additional needs that arise in this context. Finally, which phases? And here we want to look at the pre-crisis preparation phase, the emergency phase, and the post-crisis phase, and it's pretty clear that things can be done in each. On that, and in the interest of time, let me move to the next slide. To already give you, if you could advance to the next slide, please, already give you a sense of areas for action that we've identified at each of those phases. What's clear at the pre-crisis phase is that we need to find ways to integrate migrants, their needs and their vulnerabilities systematically into preparedness at national, regional, and international levels. This means that migrants need to be accounted for in disaster risk reduction and disaster management systems, just like nationals are. That's a core element. You'll see some others in the pre-crisis phase. Second, let me move to the next slide, please. During the emergency phase, you'll see the areas for action that have already been identified. Two in particular that I would like to call attention to, that the imperative has to be saving lives, and related to that, that migrants should receive non-discriminatory assistance and tailored assistance and protection, meaning that they should receive the same protection and assistance that nationals receive. That's the key. Absolute immediate save lives priority and without discrimination based on the non-citizen status. And let me move now to the third area, the post-crisis phase. And the key here, you'll see several areas that we've already started to identify. The one that I'd like to underline is that we need to think about the post-crisis phase in a development context, because the implications of the post-crisis phase really go to the human development of migrants and their families, as well as the impacts on the countries of origin to which many will be returning, and the impact on the country in crisis, which now may have an outflow of skilled or non-skilled labor that was contributing in a very fundamental way and may be needed for recovery. What I've called attention to there are just some of the key ideas that are emerging to date. Let me end by saying that this is to be an open consultative process. We are holding 6 regional consultations sponsored by the European Commission and organized by the International Center on Migration Policy Development. 2 of those have taken place already. 4 more will take place over the course of the year. There's also a dedicated CSO consultation, which will be hosted by the US and Australia in in January of next year, a dedicated private sector consultation and international organization consultation. And finally, and this is my last point, we would like to reach out to civil society to encourage you to help us identify effective practices, identify things that can be done, and I encourage you to look at the MICIC website, where there is a page, a portal to share your practices, share your ideas, not only for yourselves, but also what you would like to see from others. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for those further details and reminding us that no country is immune to these types of concerns, which further highlights the importance of our initiative and what we're here discussing today. Michelle also laid out for us some of the important vulnerabilities that migrants face in such crisis situations and how our work to date has grappled with these issues so far. And thank you again for briefly outlining our work to date and what lies ahead. Michelle also showed you on her slides the web portal and some of the ways for connecting, and we'll certainly come back to that at the end so you have a chance to remind on how you can connect with us. Next, I'd like to turn over to Mr. John Bingham of ICMC, who's now going to discuss the role that civil society, that you all play in supporting migrants as they seek to mitigate the impacts of crises on their lives. So please, John.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Thanks to the US, Australia, and IOM for having this webinar and being so serious about civil society in this joint enterprise that invested in this new system for webinar, this new technology. So thank you. Civil society, I think we can say broadly, approaches this work as urgent. We approach it as subjects in the sense that we are the migrants and the foreigners on the ground with the diaspora. We approached it as self-actors, self-protectors, automatic reflexes of protection in crises, as well as as partners. So very much glad to be here. ICMC itself, my organization, my NGO, was on the ground in Libya. We had close to a dozen of our staff people in the camps that immediately sprung up to try and respond to the emergency there in Tunisia and across in Egypt as well. So we know kind of the starting ground for this initiative. We know the urgency. We know the need for multiple actors and our own responsibility as an NGO and as migrant-oriented to be there and to be there more in a more organized way. I'm glad that our partners in Caritas Lebanon will give further examples of on-the-ground work alongside governments in these crisis situations. We've had civil society, any number of consultations specifically towards MICIC, but even more broadly on crises and on situations of migrant suffering and transit situations. But very directly, several consultations, as I think Michelle just mentioned, tied directly to the government-led work on MICIC. Paul and Raja will speak more about that in a moment. But I would say that the more we work on this MICIC and the more we work together with governments and IOM and others, the more we feel it is on the right track to respond, as Kate said a moment ago, in deeply practical ways. And as Michelle underscored, much more consistently and much more fully with all of the actors, beginning very much with migrants themselves in the crisis situations. So we know MICIC is good, in its orientation. We know the urgency of focusing on conflict and disaster situations, desperately needed improvement in measures and reaction. We know the need for better protection and assistance measures, both before, during, and after crises, as this MICIC project will take forward. We know that, and like very much, that the focus is wise enough, and even in some ways evolutionary enough to look not only at so-called migrants, however they're defined, but all non-citizens, because our own experience as ICMC in Libya, and I'm sure Caritas Lebanon's and others on the ground, as well as governments and agencies, is that in a crisis, people aren't walking around with labels on their head identifying which category of foreigner they are. They and we are in crisis in those moments. So very much like that. And lastly, very much appreciate that civil society is directly involved in this development measures and responses and systems. Colin will talk more about that in a moment. Last point, we also think MICIC can be not only very good, but it can be great. We think it can be great if it really fully involves migrants and diaspora in the process. And civil society, we talk to ourselves, that's up to us as well. We have to step forward in the moment, we have to step forward with substance, step forward with our responsibilities. It's up to us to engage. Second, we think MICIC can be not only very good, but perhaps great, if it really goes beyond the current definition of crisis as conflict and disaster to the other crises that migrants and non-citizens experience. Maybe an application of what is developed in MICIC, and maybe that is one more commendation of MICIC as a first approach. When we talk about going beyond crises, as currently defined, civil society will always point to the need for more systematic protection and assistance to migrants in transit crises. Crises, the very word that's used all the time these days to refer to what's happening in this region of Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Fourth, in all of this, that we begin with a needs-first approach that leads to rights-based protection and assistance, especially because the crises. It's needs first, and then rights-based applications. And last, the point civil society will always make, and we appreciate that MICIC is making more and more explicit, that the availability and access to basic rights, to recognize core human rights in ordinary times, is the best protection for migrants and other non-citizens in moments of crises. That's the best. Whatever we might add on or bring in or develop even in MICIC, it's the rights in ordinary times that make all the difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you particularly for those personal ICMC reflections from the Libya crisis in 2011, and also that helps really drive home the urgency of the issue, of these issues. Thank you for the support on this initiative and our close collaboration to date. We're looking forward to continuing that. You also reminded us of the importance of diaspora and migrants themselves, and thank you very much for highlighting that. it certainly goes without saying that we appreciate the voice of civil society in this initiative. And some of the issues, John, that you just highlighted, I would just like to point out that we will address some of these in the question and answer period, in the discussion period. So thank you very much. So thank you, John, for those comments. I would now like to turn over to Mr. Colin Raja of the Global Coalition on Migration, who is joining us from San Francisco, and he will discuss a bit more on how civil society organizations are connecting to the MICIC initiative. So I would like to please ask our excellent Blue Jean technicians if we could toggle over to Mr. Colin Raj for the video, and we'll hear his presentation. Thank you. Please, Colin.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Michelle. And again, I echo John's comments to thank you, Michelle, and the United States, as well as the IOM Secretary, the other Michelle, for hosting this, and Australia as well. So, much appreciated. Just to underline again some of the things that John said, this initiative is really important to us as we, following the high-level dialogue in 2013, Civil Society committed to what is commonly referred to a 5-year, 8-point agenda. Point 3 of that agenda plan refers specifically to migrants in distress and everything that relates to that. And we kind of underlined that. And from GCM, the Global Coalition on Migration, a lot of our members underlined how important that was, how critical that was, none so more critical than what we have going on right now in the world. And focus the next 5 years as one of our core areas of work. So we really welcomed when MICIC was launched the following year and jumped right in head first into all of it. Just to kind of highlight really quickly, and if the moderator will be okay, I'm going to now share the screen that I have here. This is just to highlight from our own website, a dedicated page in terms of all the work that we're doing around migrants in crisis in general, with support from the MacArthur Foundation, but specifically around MICIC, and just want to highlight the work that we're doing around the regional consultation. So as Michelle Klein-Solomon just recently mentioned, that the regional consultations underway, already 2 concluded and the 3rd one coming up. In relation to that and in parallel to that, we're also with Migration and Development Network, John's organization, ICMC, jointly organizing a series of civil society consultations at this point, the day or 2 days before the government consultation, usually at the same cities. So for example, in Southeast and South Asia, we held a civil society consultation led by Migrant Forum in Asia. Sorry, let me just jump there. Led by Migrant Forum in Asia on the 21st and 22nd of March. And then following that, 3 months later, for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, we had a civil society consultation on the 24th of June. All of these documents related to those consultations, the background, the agenda, outcome documents, and the reports delivered to the government consultations are all available on our website, and we'll be uploading more information, more background information, as well as a cumulative report that we will be finalizing as a paper after all the consultations has been concluded next year. This cumulative report will be a compilation of the key points that have come out from the consultations so far, and underlining some of the key recommendations going into the guidelines and principles next year. So yeah, again, this is the kind of webpage we have dedicated to it, the MICIC initiative specifically, and this is just really quickly put together, but we'll be uploading more and more information on this as we go along. But in relation to the regional civil society consultations, as you can see, if we just click on any of these documents, we'll get the agenda, the background, the outcome document, as well as the presentation by the rapporteurs for each consultations. Just to highlight, coming out of Manila, I think some of the couple of things that really came out really strongly. Again, kind of going back to something that John mentioned earlier, in terms of human rights at all times, not just in times of crisis. Again, underlining the pre-crisis situations that human rights are best protected in times of crisis if they are protected before crisis. The empowerment of migrants to act collectively, again, even before crisis situations. A number of regions and states were identified where there are strict restrictions and limitations in migrant organizing, trade union organizing, and other related associations that prevented better protections of human rights and protections of migrants in situations of crisis when that occurred. So these are a couple of things that already has jumped out. And finally, also to underline that being able to consult migrant communities is essential. The best way to find migrants in times of crisis is through migrant communities themselves. And we already have that existing within our networks, within our collections. Able to cooperate even before crisis situations enables us to be able to respond collectively much better during crisis situations. That came out of Manila, just to highlight also what came out of our Brussels consultation for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Again, underlining human rights at all times. That seems to be a running theme in terms of how to best protect that. And again, migrants as crucial partners in those situations. We also had kind of highlighted specifically for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the gray zones or the frozen conflict zones where there's ongoing crisis, but is not perhaps in the public and the media's forefront at all times. And these are some of the areas that was highlighted in the consultations as we're needing particular attention in terms of the treatment of migrants and the situation migrants are caught in those situations. So again, these are some of the things that we've kind of underlined in our consultation so far. We'll be uploading much more information on this site, but we just want to highlight, as I know we'll be turning over to Bruno at Caritas Lebanon very soon. Our very next consultation for the Middle East and North Africa will actually take place in about a month's time in Beirut, hosted by Caritas Lebanon. And we look forward to engagement with more civil society in the regional consultations and going forward in this initiative. And thank you again to the IOM Secretariat, the US and Australia for hosting the webinar and for the engagement of civil society in this.
Great, thank you very much, Colin. And we can now toggle back to Geneva for our technicians. Thank you very much. Again, Colin, thank you for the support that you've expressed for the initiative, and it's very encouraging to hear about the civil society activities that are underway. And we also appreciate pointing us towards the many online tools and resources that are already available and will become available in the future. I will turn the floor over to Mr. Bruno Ater, who is the director of Lebanon Migrant Center. They'll share some perspectives from the field. Before we turn over, I just want to remind everyone of the time. I'm sorry, Bruno, that's what comes with being the last speaker, so I apologize, but we do want to make sure to have time for some open question and answer and discussion. So I will just make that reminder right there. We still are looking okay to have a little bit of discussion time. So if I could ask our Blue Jean technicians to toggle over to Lebanon to Bruno, I give you the floor. Thank you.
I hope you can hear me properly. It's good again to connect with everybody. It's been a while. I see a lot of friendly faces that I've met before, and I'm happy to be able to connect again. I'm going to try to be brief as much as possible. But again, Caritas Lebanon is a good example of how civil society on the field can actually do some good implementation of activities in service of the migrants who are in need the most. Just very briefly, background about Caritas Lebanon, the Migrant Center, which started in 1994, passed through several crises. In 2006, the July war in Lebanon, then Libya 2011, and now we have the big Syria crisis, which is a big issue we're dealing with right now. It's been ongoing since 2011. Basically, Caritas Lebanon is involved in different types of services, whether it's direct services directly to beneficiaries, so shelter, psychosocial support, legal support, any type of support that medical support, for example. So any type of support that a migrant in need would need in tough circumstances. Of course, in addition to some advocacy and lobbying activities, which we do with the government and other local stakeholders in Lebanon. The strength, I think, of any NGO working in this field, whether locally or internationally, is to be able to come together on the same page with all the stakeholders, which is the strong point of Caritas Lebanon, where we have very good connections, with other stakeholders, so the embassies, the consulates, the communities themselves, with the government, with international partners and networks like MFA, ICMC, the UN, IOM. So we have, it's very important to be able to connect with all these people, just to be able to bridge all these efforts and concentrate all this energy in providing the services in the right way. So that's one of the strong points for helping migrants. Another very important is to connect with people from the communities, from the actual countries, and from the communities in other countries. So, for example, we have very good connection with our colleagues, with other colleagues in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Philippines, and Africa, with other NGOs in other countries. So that's another very important point, to be able to work together for reintegration later on, for communication, for sharing resources. Let me see. So I guess that would be I wouldn't want to go into a lot of details, but I think being able to be in the field, knowing that a lot of migrants are in need, would like to go back home in crises like in Lebanon, for example, when we had the wars, and now the Syria crisis. We are there to help people who need the most any type of services. We are there to support, to provide these services, to help these people, but also to be able to give them a chance to go out of the conflict and be able to go back home to their countries and families. So we've been doing that for years now, and this is what we focus on right now.
Bruno, if technicians toggle back to Geneva, please. Great. So while we have the image coming back to Geneva, for your comments and for reminding us of the range of services that migrants can require in a time of crisis, and the critical response role that civil society plays on the ground. And it's also very encouraging that you remind us that civil society is a global network, and not only can you call on the assistance of services from between countries and the networks on the ground, but also the lessons learned between among this network of civil society. So thank you very much for reminding us of that. We are now going to move into looking at the clock. Let's hopefully get 10 minutes at the least of some open discussion. We've had some questions that have come in along the way. So I think first we're going to start with a few overarching questions that I'd like to hand over to Michelle Klein-Solomon, the director of the Secretariat. I'll read these out loud for all the participants. The first question, Michelle, is why is the MICIC initiative limited to natural disasters and conflicts? And what about other types of crises migrants are facing, such as in Europe and in Asia? So that would be the first. That's looking at the scope of the initiative. The second question that hopefully you could address would be, how can the outcome of the MICIC initiative be applied to broader context, including migrants experiencing crises in transit? So I'd like to hand this over to Michelle. These are two questions related to the scope of the initiative.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks to the colleagues from who are participating for writing in with your questions and comments today. I think the scope question is an important one, and I want to say from the outset that the fact that the initiative is limited to migrants of crises that are natural disasters and conflicts, and migrants who are already in a country when that experiences, when that occurs, is in no way meant to suggest that other migrants don't face crises or are in need of protection and assistance. There's no way to open a newspaper or turn on a TV today and to see what's happening in the Mediterranean and elsewhere and to think that those are not urgent and needy situations. So there's not a value judgment from the initiative to suggest that those migrants who are already inside a country are more important or that their needs are more significant. The reason for the limitation is simply one of being able to bite off and chew and manage and develop something concrete within a framework that is understandable and definable. So a scope that is possible to identify and parameters within which to address situations. So again, and not a value judgment that other migrants are not in need. As Michelle hinted, and this is really the key point going forward, it's already clear that what is coming out of this exercise will be relevant for migrants well beyond the scope of this initiative. And here I would like to underline something that both John and Colin said, that it is absolutely clear from the outset of the consultations here that the better protected migrants' rights are in normal times, the better able they will be to be resilient in the face of crisis, and the better the protections will be for them. And it's already clear to me that that will be one of the fundamental messages coming out of this, and we'll be looking at very concrete, practical ways to make that a reality. So very specifically, what does that mean to make sure that migrants' rights are protected in normal times? So just to finish up very briefly, it's clear that the guidelines and the effective practices that will be coming out here will be relevant for a much wider range of circumstances. And it's our hope that governments around the world, as well as other stakeholders, will take to heart and utilize in their policies, in their planning, and in their programs the lessons, the experiences, the practices that we identify here. And the application of those in crisis contexts will mean that they will apply more broadly in other situations as well, to the benefit of migrants more broadly. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I certainly drawing on your remarks that the lessons learned and some of the issues that come up in the course of this initiative, certainly there's a spectrum of different types of crises that migrants could face, and certainly the hope is that lessons learned can be used in other situations as well. So thank you very much for those further details. I have a question here that has come in that I think it would be good for perhaps some of the our government participants to address. Perhaps Kate, and I know on the line we have some folks from the State Department in Washington, D.C. So perhaps we'll start with Kate and then maybe move over to Washington as applicable. And the question gets at the initiative aims to produce a set of non-binding voluntary principles and guidelines. And there's three questions sort of coming after this, so I'd ask those who respond perhaps to take whichever the most applicable. One is, what is the added value of the document? How do you see these voluntary non-binding guidelines being implemented, and what role can civil society play in implementation? So I think these are good questions perhaps that the governments could answer, and how they see this initiative moving forward once the final outcome is issued. So I'll start with Kate, who's here in Geneva, and then we can move over to Washington. So Kate.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, because if we're going to put our efforts behind something, it's always relevant to ask what is going to be the value out of that. I think it's been very interesting being part of some of the regional consultations, how many interesting things have been tabled in relation to how we are responding and the types of responses that we could apply and the treatments we could apply in the context of migrants in crisis. And these are not necessarily responses that come from the migration field. And I think, you know, we've seen that there's a sort of consular dimension to this. There's other parts of our governments, for example, that have a role to play in and how these how we could best address these sorts of scenarios. So, you know, I can see, for example, from a government perspective, from a bureaucrat's perspective, the value of having documentation which really sort of covers the breadth and scope of the types of areas of policies and programs that need to be put in place for governments that really might go across various ministries and various responsibilities of the delivering agencies. So I see that as being really critical. And the other thing that I was really struck by with the consultations is really how much innovation there has been in the private sector, for example, and great examples like we've heard today from civil society in terms of those responses. So I think the value in this is also the process that we're going through right now by really raising the profile of the issue and really exploring it jointly as shared stakeholders to the issue. And I think that's really, you know, in terms of what document it will be, the process now is already delivering in terms of a value add, in my view. And how we implement that, I think that's really sorts of the questions that we need to continue to ask ourselves as we're going through the process. And certainly civil society is part of that process, and it's clearly, you know, part of the implementation. I, you know, think about the way in which we work as governments with civil society in a consultative fashion, certainly in the design of programs. And, you know, I think that if there's something which is a product in the end that is the results of the efforts of the shared stakeholders, then that brings real legitimacy to those outcomes.
Great, thank you very much, Kate. And I think that what you've said is key. Is there is value in the process of bringing all of these existing practices, innovations from different areas of government, different areas of civil society, bringing them all together in one place. I think that's a really key point. So thank you for highlighting that. I'm mindful of time, and I do want to. I do have a few questions here to pose for our civil society panelists. But briefly, I just wanted to give the opportunity to any participants from the State Department in Washington, if you wanted to weigh in on any of these questions. This is we have our colleagues here, so if you'd like to weigh in, please go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to second what Kate said. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation today. I don't have much to add other than the guidelines are going to be as good as we make them. So whatever practical steps that you can add, we're very appreciative of that. I think the implementation is going to depend on how useful everyone sees the outcome as. So we really encourage you to take notes at the end of this webinar on how to submit your effective practices on the website. In addition to the in-person consultations, we'd love to hear more from people like Bruno on the front lines who can share their direct experiences and educate us as government partners, but also to share with each other what you're doing well, what works, what to continue, and what we can improve as well. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that input. I'm still keeping an eye on the watch, but I do want to have a chance to give the floor to John or Colin or Bruno with a couple of questions to throw open the debate a bit, and this of course is an ongoing discussion. I would just like to pose for you some of the questions that came in. One, what are the main challenges for civil society in being able to protect migrants caught in countries experiencing crisis? And related, and very relevant to our discussion here today and going forward, what does civil society need from this initiative in order to better protect and assist migrants? What messages do you have for this initiative on what you need to further enhance your work? So I think just in terms of technology, let's turn it over to John first here in Geneva before we go to Colin or Bruno. So John?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think I'll just give 2 sentences and then turn it over to Bruno and Colin, who always have more insight than I do. And I think we need very much civil society to be fully engaged at the table. You know, we've said that, but to underscore it and to take it forward. And second, I think we need civil society to be meaningfully in the system of practices and responses and assistance, including, frankly, to the migrants and other citizens who are in transit situations in the contexts of these crises of natural disaster and conflict, because we know that quite a bit of the practices, especially during and after crises, relate to the non-citizens and migrants who are moving, who are in the transit situation. That's what ICMC worked with on the ground outside Libya in 2011. So those two sentences, meaningfully involved in the preparation and meaningfully involved in the actual on-the-ground responses and practices.
Great, thank you very much, John. And certainly, as civil society is such a vital partner, the meaningful engagement is definitely a key message. So thank you for highlighting that. I'd like to give a few real brief seconds, perhaps, to Colin in San Francisco, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Just to underline again, I think in terms of challenges, the pre-crisis situation is really critical, and enhancing human rights situations, protections of free association, all of those are really critical to ensure the best level of protections and assistance being provided during crisis and post-crisis. That keeps coming up as a common theme in our consultations. And in terms of what's needed from MICIC, I think, again, just to really underline what John just said, real engagement from civil society. I think, as we've kind of mentioned before, the best way to find migrants is through migrant associations and our networks that are really organized. And the best way to provide assistance and to provide protection during crisis situations is to work through those networks already in existence.
Great, thank you, Colin, for reinforcing those points and reminding us of the importance of migrants and diaspora communities themselves. I just would like to turn over for maybe a few brief remarks to Bruno in Lebanon, and just a note for our very gracious Blue Jean technicians. We will wrap up shortly after this, so thank you very much for bearing with us. Bruno, I'll hand it over to you if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, just briefly, I just wanted to re-emphasize the point that migrants who in crisis don't necessarily have to be in a country that is in crisis. Lebanon, whether in crisis or not, we had the support that was required, that was needed by the migrants in need or vulnerable migrants was the same in both cases. So whether it's a lot of migrants victims of trafficking, who are victims of trafficking or who have very specific needs, are in countries that are in a normal situation, not necessarily in crisis mode. This is something that we really need to keep in mind. And again, re-emphasize the role of civil society and working together as a one big group of stakeholders working for the same goal, because one side alone cannot do it. Caritas Lebanon alone cannot do it. I mean, if we don't work with the government, if we don't work with the other NGOs, with the international community, or with the international networks, if we don't get support from each other, then our services will be properly channeled. So that's it from my end.
Great, thank you, Bruno. And I think that's a really great transition into our wrap up, and that we're all in this together. And I think that is a really key point, that no one can do this alone. And this is exactly why we're so keen to have such a broad stakeholder involvement and a key involvement from civil society and their voice in this initiative. So thank you very much for reinforcing that point. And with that, I would like to move on into our wrap up from our discussion today. I think there's 3 key points that have really come out, and many of the discussions have fit under these three key points. First, there's a shared understanding of the urgency of this issue and the value of a government-led multi-stakeholder initiative. So I think that our discussion today has really highlighted that point and certainly puts us in the current context of really the urgency of addressing this issue. The second point is that we've heard both from Michelle Klein-Solomon from the MICIC Secretariat on the government-led consultations, but also from Colin on the civil society consultations, that there are key ideas that are already emerging about what can be done at all phases, pre, during, and post-crisis phase, and by all stakeholders to better prepare for and respond to migrants caught in crisis. And a core message here that is reverberating both in the government consultations and among civil society is that the protection of rights at all times is a really key fundamental message here. So I think that's really been highlighted in our discussions today. The third and final point I wanted to make is precisely the words that Kate gave to us just a moment ago, that there is a value in this process. The value is this discussion and the process of bringing all these practices together. The open, consultative, and key role of civil society, both in the process and on the ground, and we certainly welcome your input, your continued partnership in this initiative, and would like to remind you, in that vein, we'd like to thank you for your participation today, and thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you to our Blue Jean technicians. We greatly appreciate your help. Without you, we would not have been able to do this. So thank you very much. We look forward to continuing this conversation. This is an ongoing conversation. This is not 1 hour. This is not reserved to 1 hour. We really look forward to continuing these discussions. Today's webinar materials will be sent to participants. It will also be posted on the website. So the presentation that Michelle made will be available on the website so that our participants can be reminded of some of the discussions or some of the things we may have briefly touched upon today. So I would like to remind that. Finally, I would just like to recall for all participants, and please socialize this amongst your global network as we've heard about, please visit our website, micicinitiative.iom.int. So that's MICIC, M-I-C-I-C, initiative, all one word, .iom.int. We look forward to having you visit our website. And you can connect with the initiative and continue to submit creative solutions and best practices directly to this site. You can see a screenshot on your screen right now of our website. We greatly look forward to continuing this conversation and continuing our great collaboration in this initiative. And thank you very much for your participation today. Thank you again to our panelists and to our technicians.
Good job.
Thank you.